Ladies and gentlemen, we have a terrific program in store for you this evening. And to open the inaugural Grand Strategy Summit, it is my honor and privilege to welcome from New York Dr. Henry Kissinger, America's 56th Secretary of State and 7th National Security Advisor. Thank you for being with us, Mr. Secretary.
It is a great privilege for me to be invited to the first Grand Strategy seminar of the Nixon Foundation, because I spent 6 years of my life working daily with President Nixon, and the remaining decades of his life in close contact with him. In a recent book, I described Richard Nixon as the American president most similar to Theodore Roosevelt in his approach to international politics. Nixon was a strategist who had tried to establish the relationship between American challenges and to find solutions in which progress could be made on key issues simultaneously, dangers reduced, and opportunities enhanced. Richard Nixon became president at a fraught moment in American history. In the years before, there had been 3 assassinations of major American figures, including the president and his brother. The war in Vietnam had gone through a communist offensive that multiplied casualties, and it had been going on for nearly 10 years. The American public was bitterly divided over the war, and massive demonstrations prevented public appearances by President Johnson, who had to confine his visits outside the White House to military installations. The Soviet Union and its allies had occupied Czechoslovakia for daring to pursue an autonomous foreign policy. Dialogue with Russia had broken off. Of course, China was totally outside any set of relationships with the United States. The Middle East was in turmoil. The '67 war had altered the map of the region, but no alternate system had yet emerged, and the participants in the war were gearing for another conflict. In this situation, with an unsolved Vietnam problem, with crises in the Middle East, recent aggression in Europe, hostility with the Soviet Union, and no contact with China, Richard Nixon became president, and he honored me by appointing me his security advisor. It was a remarkable decision because I had never met Richard Nixon, and in fact had been closely associated with Nelson Rockefeller, who was a close friend of mine in the period before. So it was an act of courage to make such a decision, and it showed something of the way Nixon handled his challenges. General Eisenhower told me afterwards that he had been opposed to the appointment because he didn't think academics could operate at that level of government effectively. I look back on this period of association and leadership by Richard Nixon with great pride, because Richard Nixon introduced a concept of strategic thinking to American foreign policy. Early on in his administration, he distributed a memorandum to the various key figures involved in foreign policy making that the president intended to avoid the approach of treating each problem on its so-called merits, because that would lead to the possibility of aggressors picking out the weakest points and keeping quiet on the key issues. So Nixon believed that the issues needed to be related to each other. And that particularly was true of the Soviet Union, so that the Soviet Union should not be able to alternate periods of so-called peaceful coexistence with periods of confrontation, but rather it would be obliged by American policy to concentrate on issues of great importance to us if they wanted to make progress on issues of consequence to them. And he carried out this policy during his 6.5 years in office, starting with the Jordan crisis in the summer of 1970, and then through a series of Middle East crises in which Nixon displayed his characteristic quality, which was composed of two elements. One was that if American security was challenged, Nixon would resist at the highest level of power that was not yet nuclear war, but in a series of crises. He went on alert 3 times during crises in the Middle East. But at the end of that process, he had made it lead to what was another major component, that confrontation was not an end in itself. Confrontation had to have a substantive political purpose that improved the situation, and in which the challenger might develop over time an interest in maintaining the international system. So the confrontations in the Middle East led to a series of peace agreements between Egypt and Israel, between Syria and Israel, and between Jordan and Israel, all of which had been prepared by Nixon's willingness to fight over the strategic issues and then to move towards negotiation after the issues had been dealt with. In this process, the Soviet Union at first was extremely challenging, but Nixon increased the defense budget, though not as much as he desired because of congressional opposition, and originated a series of weapon systems that became the tools of subsequent administrations, and such as land-based strategic weapons and strategic defense. One of his signal achievements was the opening to China, an idea with which he entered office. And that too bore the Nixon characteristics of combining strategy with tactical flexibility. At the time of Nixon entering office, it was considered axiomatic that the relationship between China was destined to be in permanent confrontation. But Nixon calculated that it was not normal and not feasible to ignore one of the largest countries in the world. And therefore, against wide opposition, he opened a dialogue with China, which became one of the principal elements of his foreign policy. The reason for that was that between the Soviet Union and China, ideological tensions had developed even prior to Nixon's term in office, which accelerated afterwards. And it came to our attention that there were conflicts and military clashes between Soviet and Chinese troops at a faraway place at the Manchurian border between China and Russia. When that report was placed before him, Nixon noted, of course, the fact that a conflict between the two countries would present new challenges to the United States. But he decided first that in a conflict between two adversaries, we would lean towards the weaker against the stronger, even if we had not yet established relationships with the weaker. Secondly, as our policy developed, he issued instructions which basically said that we should place the American interests in such a way that we were closer to Russia and to China than they were to each other, giving us a maximum flexibility. By these methods, he created a situation in which the great issues with which he entered the conflict, the presidency, were settled or approaching settlement during his period in office. He had proclaimed very early in his period in office that we would not end the Vietnam War by betraying the people who, in reliance on an American promise, had sacrificed tens of thousands of their citizens. And he maintained that promise. And he achieved an honorable peace, which can be defined as follows. In early 1972, Nixon made a series of proposals to the North Vietnamese to end the war on specific terms. 8 months later, after having attempted an offensive, a major offensive, to avoid these terms, the Vietnamese accepted them. We could not maintain the assumptions on which the peace had been made because of the divisions in our country had made it impossible to achieve the military commitments that were needed to sustain them. But at the end of his term and of its period in office, Nixon had given a new strategy and a new meaning and a new direction to American foreign policy that linked power to purpose and moved America to a position where at that point it was dominating the policy in the Middle East had achieved military superiority in the military field and was engaged in meaningful discussions with adversaries which had a rational vision of peace at the end of it. Of course, conditions have changed, and the definition of the priority of adversaries has changed with the change in their capabilities. But the basic vision of Nixon, of maintaining the values of America, the security of our country, and in the context of a world order in which other nations could feel secure and supported to participate. That was his great contribution. And so I want to thank you all for inviting me here. There are many in your group who participated in some of these efforts, and all of you are trying to remember a leader who took over his country in adversity, found enormous domestic challenges, and emerged from it with a vision and a direction that American foreign policy needs to study and apply. And it was an honor for me to be a contributor to these efforts, for which I'll be forever grateful to Richard Nixon. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Thank you for joining us and opening the Grand Strategy Summit.